My name is Haley Wittman. I'm 37 years old and a major general in the United States Army. But just days before my brother's wedding, my own mother shoved a starched white apron into my hands and said coldly, "You're not family, Haley. You're a guest worker. Now make yourself useful." That was the moment I realized she wasn't just dismissing me. She was trying to erase me. She didn't know I owned the very ground she stood on. She didn't know her carefully staged wedding would become the battlefield where I reclaimed everything she'd stolen from me. I didn't come to fight with words. I came with truth, silence, and stars on my shoulder. Before we begin this story of silence, betrayal, and a reckoning you won't forget, I want to ask, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Subtle Revenge Stories to hear more stories that truly matter. They say your childhood home should feel like a sanctuary. For me, it felt like enemy territory. The moment I pulled into the circular driveway of my mother's grand colonial mansion in Milan, Virginia, I felt my stomach twist, not from nerves but from memory. The white columns gleamed in the late afternoon sun, as if daring me to cross a threshold I hadn't stepped through in years. I shut off the engine, sat in silence, and reminded myself who I was. Major General Haley Wittman. 2 stars, countless missions, and a lifetime of service. But as I pushed open that heavy wooden door, I knew none of that mattered here. The scent of lemon polish and wealth filled my lungs as I stepped into the grand marble foyer. It was just as cold as I remembered. My eyes darted to the wall above the staircase where my West Point graduation photo used to hang. Gone. In its place was an oversized oil painting of my mother and my younger brother Liam, dressed like royalty at some charity gala, smiling as if they were the only 2 people that mattered. I had been erased. Then she appeared. Eleanor, my mother. Still flawless, still frosted in silk and Chardonnay. She didn't greet me, didn't smile, just looked at me the way a woman looks at a shoe she thought she'd thrown away. Her eyes scanned my jeans and sweater like they were an insult to her decor. And then she said it, her voice soft, sweet, venomous. "Your room is upstairs, next to the storage room. Get your own towels." She turned and resumed talking to the wedding planner, as if I were a maid passing through. That night, the house swelled with people, politicians, lobbyists, socialites. I stood among them invisible, the general reduced to background noise. I tried to make small talk. I tried to belong. But every time I opened my mouth, I felt like a stranger in a foreign land. Then Eleanor approached me again, this time, smiling brightly, almost theatrically. She pressed something into my hand. A white apron. "Why don't you help with the hors d'oeuvres, dear? You're used to serving, aren't you?" A few people chuckled politely, not quite sure if it was a joke. Liam saw it. He saw everything. And he turned away. In that moment, the stars on my shoulders didn't matter. My medals, my tours, my sacrifices, none of it did. I was just a helper in their story. A prop. I stood there in the middle of marble and crystal, holding a starchy white apron, and felt a wave of heat rise to my cheeks. Shame. Not for who I was, but for allowing myself to walk into their world again, thinking something might have changed. Have you ever returned home only to be told wordlessly that you no longer belong there? What would you do if the people who should be proud of you humiliate you instead? The next morning, I stood in the foyer again, staring up at the oil painting as the early light filtered through the glass. The absence of my photo wasn't just a careless oversight, it was intentional. I had been removed like a stain they couldn't bear to acknowledge. My entire existence, 4 deployments, a silver star, a purple heart, a lifetime of quiet discipline meant less to my mother than a glossy photo of Liam in a rented tux. She didn't just forget me. She replaced me. I wandered the halls like a stranger in my own past. The house hadn't changed. The polished mahogany banisters still gleamed. The grandfather clock still chimed every half hour like it had since I was a child. But every detail screamed that this wasn't my place anymore. Maybe it never was. The laughter from the sitting room floated down the hall. The clinking glasses, the inside jokes, the familiar voices that had no space for mine. I paused outside the room where my photo once hung, and for a brief moment I imagined what it would be like if I'd never come back at all. Would they have even noticed later that day I stepped into the kitchen? The staff florists, caterers, coordinators moved with mechanical precision. I saw a woman around my age arranging petit fours on a silver tray. She smiled at me, genuinely. It was the first kindness I'd received since I arrived. She didn't know who I was, but for a moment, I felt seen. And then I heard the sound I dreaded, heels on marble, purposeful and sharp. Eleanor walked in, eyes sweeping the room like a queen entering court. She zeroed in on me immediately. "Haley, darling," she said, her tone theatrical, meant for an audience. "Could you help in the greenhouse? The orchids need misting, and you were always good with the little things." Her voice was syrupy, but her eyes were stone. I didn't answer. I didn't argue. I just walked to the nearest trash bin, untied the apron from my waist, and dropped it in without a word. The clink of the metal clasp hitting the steel echoed louder than any scream. Later that night, in the cramped guest room beside the storage closet, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fans spinning in slow, squeaky circles. The silence was different now. Not the silence of dignity, but the silence of exile. I had followed every rule, served with honor, lived a life my father would have been proud of. But here in this house, it didn't matter. I was still the girl who ruined the family aesthetic. Have you ever had to ask yourself why your success threatens the very people who should have celebrated it? Why do some families only love you when you're small enough to control? I woke before dawn the next morning, unable to breathe under the weight of my own silence. The house was still asleep, wrapped in its cocoon of curated perfection, but I felt suffocated by everything it refused to say. I needed air, real air, not the kind filtered through antique drapes and polished brass. So I left. I didn't leave a note. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just slipped into my Ford Explorer and drove east toward the one place that had always felt honest. Arlington National Cemetery was still cloaked in early morning mist when I arrived. The gates stood open like arms I hadn't felt in years. I parked, got out, and began walking slowly among the endless rows of white headstones. The chill in the air cut through my sweater, but I welcomed it. It reminded me I was alive. The sound of my boots on gravel was steady grounding. I found the marker easily. Marcus Wittman, Colonel, United States Army, my father. The only person who had ever seen me not as an inconvenience, not as a disappointment, but as his daughter. I stood in silence, letting the weight of the moment settle in my bones. My breath came out in visible puffs. "Hey, Dad," I whispered, feeling ridiculous, but needing to say it anyway. "It's worse than you thought." I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was 13 again, sitting on the back porch under a black Virginia sky. Dad pointing at the stars, his voice steady and low. "Your mother only sees the bright ones, Haley. She likes things that shine. But you're a guide star. Quiet. Constant. You don't need to shine to lead." I hadn't thought of that night in years. But now, under the shadow of his name carved in stone, it felt like a lighthouse cutting through fog. I pulled a coin from my pocket. A challenge coin from my first command. I had carried it through Kandahar, through heartbreak, through blood and heat and grief. I placed it carefully at the base of his headstone. My tribute. My promise. My anchor. The mist began to lift as the sun broke over the horizon. Golden light spilled across the white stones, and for a moment I imagined him there beside me, calm, proud, unwavering. He would have known what to do. He would have reminded me that truth was always the better weapon. That dignity doesn't shout. It waits. It endures. And when the time is right, it speaks with thunder. Have you ever lost the only person who truly saw you and wondered how you'd ever be seen again? The drive back from Arlington was quiet, The kind of silence that doesn't press down on you, but fills you with clarity. I didn't listen to music. I didn't turn on the radio. I just let the wheels hum against the asphalt while my father's voice echoed in my mind. Be the dim star, Haley. Steady, unmoving. A guide in the dark. As I pulled back into Memland, the streets looked just as they always had, manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, trimmed hedges, but I no longer felt like I was returning to something. I was passing through. When I stepped inside the house, the party was already beginning to stir. Staff moving like chess pieces, arrangements being fluffed, glassware being counted. I passed through it like a ghost, invisible and ignored. It was easier that way. Safer. That evening, guests flooded the house again. The elite of DC senators, donors, CEOs. I stood in a corner, a glass of untouched wine in my hand, watching the crowd like a soldier watching terrain. They spoke in half-laughs, networking smiles, coded language. I didn't belong, not because I couldn't keep up, but because I refused to pretend. Then she did it again. Eleanor, my mother. She drifted toward me, glowing in her champagne-colored gown, her voice loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. Haley, darling, she said sweetly, you've always been so good with schedules. Would you mind checking in with the valet staff? Make sure the cars are in order for when the senators leave. A pause, a smile, a knife. You know how chaotic these events can be. My face didn't move. Neither did my heart. I simply looked at her, nodded once, and turned. Not because I agreed, but because I saw her now for what she truly was. Every word she spoke was a control tactic. Every smile a trap. She didn't want my help. She wanted my submission. She wanted the Major General to become the errand girl, so she could keep spinning the illusion that I was small, manageable, forgettable. I didn't go to the valet. Instead, I stepped outside, stood under the massive oak tree that shaded the west wing of the house. The air was cool, the night quiet. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small object, a ribbon I had worn in Kandahar. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even one of the top-tier medals. But it meant something to me. I stared at it for a long time, then closed my fist around it and whispered to no one. You haven't buried me, Eleanor? You've just reminded me why I need to rise. Have you ever realized that the people who belittle you the most aren't doing it because you're weak, but because your strength terrifies them? That night's sleep came in fragments, short, sharp moments of rest shattered by memories I couldn't silence. I kept replaying one day in particular. The day my West Point acceptance letter arrived. I was 17, standing in the front hallway of this very house, clutching the thick white envelope with trembling fingers. My heart had felt like it could explode from joy. I remember running to show my mother, expecting, hoping some form of pride. She took the envelope with her manicured fingers, looked at it like it was a utility bill, and tossed it onto the dining table. You're ruining your life, she said flatly. No man worth anything will marry a soldier. Especially not one from Milan. No congratulations. No hug. Just a verdict. A week later, Liam won a regional art contest, a ribbon, and a printed certificate. That night, she threw him a party with live music, champagne, and a guest list longer than his drawing was wide. I watched from the upstairs hallway unseen as 100 people toasted a sketch. That night, my father slipped into my room, held up a takeout bag, and whispered, "Get your coat." He drove us into DC to Ben's Chili Bowl, his favorite place in the world. We sat at the counter, elbows bumping grease on our fingers. He ordered us 2 chili half-smokes and handed me a small pin in a box, a brass compass. "You'll need this," he said. "Not to find your way, but to remind you that you already know it." That memory struck me now like lightning. I rolled over in the narrow guest bed and stared at the ceiling. I hadn't worn that compass since his funeral. I had buried it deep in a drawer with all the other pieces of me this house had no room for. But something had shifted. The fog was thinning. The stars were starting to come back into view. I knew this wasn't over. Eleanor had erased my face from the wall, but I had not disappeared. She had just forgotten what happens when you corner a soldier with nothing left to lose. I sat up, swung my feet onto the cold wooden floor, and whispered aloud into the dark. You wanted me quiet. Eleanor, I've been quiet long enough. The clock read 2:17 a.m. I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I made coffee, pulled out my old laptop, and began outlining a plan. Not for revenge, for reclamation, for truth, for justice, for my father, and for every part of me that still deserved to be seen. Have you ever reached a breaking point, not in anger but in clarity, when you finally realized it was time to take your story back? The morning after my sleepless night, I found myself back at the Starbucks off King Street in Alexandria, nursing a black coffee that tasted more like resolve than caffeine. My encrypted laptop hummed quietly, its screen reflecting the life my family never saw: classified reports, commendations, briefing memos stamped with Pentagon letterheads. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't shrinking. I was preparing. Then an email popped up with a single word in the subject line: coffee. The sender, Ava Russo, my brother's fiancée. A woman I had barely exchanged more than 2 sentences with. My instinct kicked in, not the kind you learn socially, but the one forged in the dust of Kandahar. This wasn't a social invitation. This was reconnaissance. We met that afternoon at a quiet cafe tucked away in DuPont Circle, the kind of place with chalkboard menus and mismatched mugs. Ava was already there when I arrived, civilian clothes, no makeup, posture straight as a flagpole. Her eyes were sharp, but not hostile. I approached, slowly gave her a nod, and said simply, "Captain." She stood and replied, "General." That one exchange told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about Liam. This was soldier to soldier. She got to the point immediately. "Ma'am, I know who you are. I know what your mother's been doing, and I want to make one thing clear: I'm not part of it." I stayed silent, letting her speak. "A year ago," she continued, "when Liam started talking about his family's influence, I ran a background check on you. Professionally. Just to verify the names. And that's when I realized." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "You were the officer who pulled my unit out of that ambush in the Argandab Valley." I stared at her. I remembered the operation. Barely. To me, it was a Tuesday in uniform. But to her, it was the day she lived. "I owe you my life," she said, her voice suddenly softer. "And I will never forget it." She looked me square in the eyes, steady and unflinching. "Whatever you need on this battlefield or any other, I'm your soldier." For a second, I didn't know what to say. I had stood in war rooms with generals, briefed heads of state-commanded men in firefights. But this quiet, unprompted loyalty, it cracked something open in me. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. I nodded. "Then you're in." She slid a small slip of paper across the table. "There's someone else you need to meet. Dr. Maya Singh. She knows your mother better than anyone, and she wants to help." As we stood to leave, Ava looked back once and said, "You saved my life, General. Now, let me help you reclaim yours." Her words stayed with me long after she left. This wasn't just about Eleanor anymore. This was about building something stronger than her illusions, an alliance born not of blood, but of earned trust. Have you ever had someone you barely knew step into your life, not to judge your past, but to help fight for your future? The next morning, I found myself standing outside a quiet brownstone in Old Town Alexandria. The brass plaque by the door read simply, "MH Consultant." The name meant nothing to most people, but Ava had written 3 words on the slip of paper beneath it: strategist. Friend, warrior. I rang the bell, and after a brief pause, the door swung open. A woman in her 60s stood before me, tall, commanding, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and instantly assessing. "General Wittman," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Maya Singh. Come in." Her voice was calm, efficient, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had once briefed presidents. The inside wasn't a therapist's office. It was a war room. One wall was covered in maps of geopolitical hotspots. Another held a massive whiteboard filled with timelines, flowcharts, and tactical notations. There were no inspirational quotes, no soft chairs, no boxes of tissues. Just focus. Just purpose. She gestured toward a sturdy table. "Ava briefed me," she said as she poured 2 cups of Earl Grey. "I've known Eleanor for over 30 years. Committees, fundraisers, social boards. I've watched her manipulate everyone around her, including your father. What she's doing now isn't just personal. It's a systematic campaign of erasure. She's not just trying to hurt you emotionally. She's trying to rewrite the narrative, seize your father's legacy, and claim sole ownership of the family image." I sat stunned but not surprised. Maya continued, her tone precise. "This is information warfare. She's using silent suggestion and social leverage as weapons. Our response will be equally strategic but cleaner. Truth, documentation, timing." She opened a drawer and placed 2 items on the table: a sleek, lipstick-sized voice recorder and a black encrypted USB drive. "From this moment on, you record everything. Every conversation, every suggestion, every threat. We are building a file. Not for revenge, for leverage, for protection." I picked up the recorder, felt its weight. It was light, but it carried history. The kind of tool used in operations where lives depended on accuracy. Maya leaned in slightly. "You've already won harder wars than this, General. But you've never fought one so close to your heart. That's why we'll fight it together." Her use of the word, we struck a nerve. I hadn't heard that word in a personal context for years. It wasn't just support. It was alliance. That night, as I lay in bed clutching the small recorder in my hand like a weapon, I realized something. This wasn't about Eleanor anymore. This was about my father's memory, my career, and every quiet sacrifice I had made for a family that only knew how to decorate around me. Maya had drawn the first line on the battlefield, and I was ready to advance. Have you ever had a stranger see through the fog of your pain and offer not pity but a plan? We met again the following evening, 3 women sitting around a war table. Not a dinner table, not a living room, but a command center. Maya's office had transformed in a matter of hours. The whiteboard now bore my mother's name at the center of a web of influence: charity boards, real estate holdings, political donors, social strategists. Ava sat across from me. Hair tied back sleeves, rolled a military file open in front of her. She had pulled floor plans of the wedding venue, access to the security system schematics, and a guest list that read like a who's who of Washington's power class. Maya paced slowly with a pen in hand, drawing arrows, adjusting timelines. I watched them work, one a captain I'd once saved in a sandstorm, the other a strategist who had spent her life in the shadows of power. Neither of them shared my blood. But they saw me. They heard me. And more than that, they believed in me. It was a strange feeling, trust. Foreign. Heavy. Sacred. I had spent so long in solitude that I forgot what it meant to have someone at your flank. We spoke in clipped sentences the way soldiers do when there's too much to say. We didn't dwell on emotion. We mapped out pressure points. We discussed contingencies. We ran simulations of what Eleanor might do. Every twist, every pivot, every reaction plotted like a tactical engagement. We weren't preparing for a wedding. We were preparing for a reckoning. Maya pointed to the name of a particular journalist on the guest list. He's ethical, tenured. If we need to leak anything, he's our first option. Ava nodded. I'll monitor social media chatter. I've already found 2 influencers attending the event who post everything in real time. If anything hits live, we'll know within seconds. I added my own layer: psychological profiling. Eleanor thrives on control, but only when she has the upper hand. If she feels the tide shift, she'll spiral. Maya looked at me, eyes narrowing in approval. Good. That's when we strike. At one point, the room fell silent. Just the hum of the air conditioning and the quiet tapping of Ava's fingers on her keyboard. I glanced around. 3 women, 1 battle, no uniforms, no flags, no orders from above. Just loyalty forged through fire. That's when it hit me. This was my family. Not the people who posed for oil paintings, but the ones willing to sit through hours of planning and precision to help me reclaim my name. Not the ones who toasted hollow victories, but the ones who quietly laid out maps so I could win the only war that ever truly mattered: being seen, being heard, being restored. Have you ever looked across a room and realized that your real family isn't defined by blood, but by who stands beside you when everything else falls apart? 2 days after our first strategy session, my phone rang. It was Eleanor. Her voice was unusually warm, like honey poured over glass. "Haley, darling," she purred. "I was thinking maybe we could have dinner, just the 2 of us." A quiet moment before the wedding chaos. My instincts immediately flared. She never asked for time alone unless there was something to gain. But Maya's words echoed in my mind. Gather intelligence. So I said I'd like that, matching her sweetness with studied neutrality. I didn't ask where we both knew. She picked the inn at Little Washington, an institution of taste and discretion. Senators sealed backroom deals there. CEOs finalized mergers there. And my mother would try to erase me over dessert there. Before I left my apartment, I slipped the small voice recorder into my clutch and turned it on with a quiet click. I wasn't going to dinner as her daughter. I was going as an operative. When I arrived, Eleanor was already seated, flawless as always, pearls at her throat, wine glass half full. She stood to greet me, brushing the air near my cheek, never actually touching me. "Haley, you look well," she said, scanning my simple black dress. Her eyes flicked with disapproval, but her smile remained fixed. We ate through courses that belonged in a museum more than on a plate. Lamb carpaccio with Caesar salad ice cream, pan-seared scallop with truffle vinaigrette, food that whispered wealth and excess. Eleanor spoke of unity, of legacy, of how family must stand together. She floated cherry-picked memories of my childhood, none of them real, all of them flattering to her. I listened silent, letting her construct her fantasy. Then came dessert and the ambush. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a slim leather folder. Placing it beside my plate, she smiled like a snake in satin. "Just a little paperwork, dear. To help consolidate the family assets. It'll make things easier for Liam's future. All you need to do is sign." I opened the folder slowly. Legal jargon spilled across the pages, but one phrase leapt out like a red flare. Relinquish all claims. This wasn't consolidation. It was surrender. She wanted me to sign away my father's home, my inheritance, my history. I looked up. Her smile was wide now, calculated. She thought she had won. I closed the folder gently and slid it back across the table. "I'll need my lawyer to review this, First Mother." Her expression cracked, just slightly. "A lawyer," she whispered, venom now threading through her voice. "Haley, we are family. Don't you trust your own mother?" I didn't answer. I didn't flinch. I just reached into my clutch, laid a $100 bill on the table, and stood. "He'll be in touch," I said calmly. Then I turned and walked away, leaving the silence and the storm behind me. Have you ever looked someone in the eye as they tried to strip you of everything, and realized in that moment you were finally stronger than their control? I returned to my apartment with my pulse steady, but my fingers clenched tight around my clutch. The voice recorder was still warm from use, the audio file already uploading to our encrypted drive. I laid the folder of legal documents flat on the coffee table and photographed each page. Within minutes, I had sent them to Maya with a simple subject line: tonight's dinner conversation. Then I waited. It didn't take long. When Maya called, her tone, usually calm and measured, had a razor's edge. "Haley, this wasn't just a casual waiver. It's a full legal forfeiture of all inheritance rights to the property. Your mother hired a specialist in family asset disputes. She was trying to bury you legally permanently." I didn't respond right away. I just let the weight of the truth sink in. I had suspected, but knowing confirmed, documented, undeniable was another wound altogether. Then came the second blow. My phone buzzed with a message from Ava. No words, just a link. I clicked it. It opened to a well-known Virginia social blog, the kind that feeds on the polished misery of high society. And there it was. The Wittman family and the prodigal daughter. A tragic story. The piece dripped with anonymous sources, all clearly fed by Eleanor. It described me as a troubled, distant daughter, with unresolved military trauma, suggested that my presence at the wedding might undermine the spirit of unity, and implied I was jealous of her brother's achievements. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the photo. They had taken an old image of me taken hours after a 72-hour mission in Kandahar. My face streaked with dirt, eyes hollow with exhaustion, uniform, rumpled mouth slightly open from lack of sleep. They had cropped it, tightly enlarged it, and captioned it simply, "Unstable veteran sister arrives in Milan." It was a violation more cutting than any legal ambush. They weren't just trying to erase me. They were trying to discredit me, reduce me to a stereotype, a warning, a shadow of who I truly was. For a moment, I sat in the dark, stunned. Then I stood, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and set it down, untouched. I walked back to the living room, sat in silence, and let the pain pass through me, not around me, not beneath me, but through. And then I reached for my laptop. I typed 4 words into the browser: Brené Brown arena speech. I found the quote, Theodore Roosevelt. "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena." I closed my eyes, and for the first time since this battle began, I smiled not with triumph, but with clarity. They had declared war on my truth. But they forgot one thing. I had survived worse than lies. I had survived war. And now I had a team. I had a plan. I had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Have you ever felt the moment where pain turns to purpose and silence becomes strategy? The morning after the article dropped, I walked into Maya's office with a different posture. Not the weary daughter, not the humiliated sister. A commander. The soldier in me had fully returned. Maya didn't need to ask. She saw it in my eyes. "It's time," I said simply. She nodded and led me to the whiteboard. In the span of 12 hours, that board had evolved into something sharper, denser, more dangerous. At the center was the Four Seasons Hotel in D.C., the wedding venue. Around it, red markers for ingress and egress points, blue lines for security coverage, green dots for AV control panels. Ava was already seated, hunched over her laptop, a Bluetooth headset tucked into one ear, scrolling through venue schematics and guest activity. "We have a 300 guest capacity," she said, barely looking up. 75% of them are high profile. 3 journalists confirmed. 2 DC influencers who stream live. This is your theater general. I pulled out a folder and handed Maya the printouts, my official service record commendations, medal citations. "I need General Vance," I said. "He'll know what to do." She glanced through the documents and nodded. "I'll draft the request." We didn't speak of feelings, only action. There was too much at stake. We worked the rest of the day like it was a live op. Ava intercepted social media rumors and flagged potential leaks. Maya arranged for a secure dossier to be timed for distribution the moment the truth went public. I refined my psychological brief on Eleanor, listing her behavioral triggers and weaknesses. Control, appearances, surprise. We weren't just planning exposure, we were planning timing, placement, optics. By nightfall, the war room glowed under the warm light of tactical urgency. The three of us stood side by side, staring at the wall. "This isn't about humiliation," Maya said softly. "This is about truth." I nodded, and reclaiming what should have never been taken. There was no bravado, no thirst for spectacle. Only the calm electric clarity that comes before a decisive strike. We weren't planning to shout. We were planning to reveal. And sometimes revelation is louder than any war cry. As I left that night, I looked back at the two women, one I had once saved, the other now saving me. And I felt something I hadn't known in decades: safety. Not from danger, but from erasure. I was no longer alone in my foxhole. Have you ever looked around a room and realized for the first time that you're finally surrounded by people who won't let you be invisible? The night before the wedding, I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. Instead, I stood in my apartment surrounded by silence, my hands methodically unpacking the garment bag I hadn't opened in years. Inside was my Class A service uniform dress, blues heavy with weight and memory. I laid it out piece by piece across the bed, the jacket, the trousers, the white-collared shirt, the tie, the shoes polished to a mirror shine. Each element precise, each crease a story. And then came the medals. One by one, I opened their boxes, removed each ribbon, each decoration, and placed it where it belonged. Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Defense Superior Service Medal, Legion of Merit. They were more than awards. They were pages torn from chapters no one in that house had ever read. I picked up the Silver Star and held it in my palm. I hadn't touched it in years. It had been awarded after that ambush in Kandahar, the same one Ava survived. I could still feel the grit of the dust on my skin, the weight of my weapon, the ringing in my ears after the explosion. I had carried a bleeding private 200 meters under enemy fire. My shoulder had shattered in the process. But I hadn't screamed. I hadn't even stopped. I had simply kept going because my soldiers needed me to. And yet in my mother's world, I was still the disappointment. The family outlier. The one who'd ruined her femininity. As I affixed the medals to my uniform, I wasn't just preparing clothes. I was putting on history. Putting on the silence I'd endured. The discipline I'd mastered. The honor I had earned with sweat and scars. I steamed the jacket until every line was sharp, every wrinkle defeated. I polished each brass button until it caught the light like gold. I ran my fingers along the stitching of the shoulder epaulettes where the two silver stars sat. They gleamed in the lamplight, quiet, unmistakable authority. When I finally stood back and looked at the completed uniform hanging before me, I didn't see a costume. I saw armor. Not for combat, but for truth. This wasn't something I wore for show. It was the only version of me that no one in my family had ever been allowed to see. I had shown up to their world in jeans and a sweater, hoping to be accepted as their own. Now I would arrive as who I really was, and they would have no choice but to see me. Have you ever realized that the only way to reclaim your worth is to walk into the very room that rejected you? Fully dressed in everything they refused to acknowledge. The Four Seasons ballroom was a masterpiece of orchestration. Crystal chandeliers glowing like halos above silk-draped tables, a string quartet playing Vivaldi so flawlessly it almost sounded mechanical, and guests gliding across the marble floor like pieces on a polished chessboard. Everything was perfect. Everything was controlled. And yet not a soul in that room knew what was about to happen. The ceremony had just begun. The minister stood at the front, welcoming guests with rehearsed warmth. Liam, ever the golden son, waited at the altar in a tailored tuxedo, grinning like his life had gone exactly to plan. and Eleanor, seated in the front row, radiated poise. She was the queen of her constructed kingdom. Until the doors opened. I stepped into the ballroom in full Class A uniform, and the silence hit like a wave. Every violin string fell still. Conversations died mid-sentence. 300 heads turned as one. The chandeliers caught the brass on my jacket, the polished metals on my chest, and most of all, the 2 silver stars on my shoulders. I didn't walk quickly. I walked deliberately, steadily, my posture straight, my chin high, not out of pride, but because I had earned every inch of that dignity. I didn't look at Eleanor. I didn't need to. I could feel her panic from across the room. I walked down the center aisle, not to the altar, not to a seat of honor, but to the very back row. I sat quietly, folded my hands in my lap. Let the silence settle into something heavier than music. I wasn't there to speak. I wasn't there to disrupt. I was there to be seen, finally unmistakably seen. The minister cleared his throat and stumbled through the next few lines, but the atmosphere had shifted permanently. Every guest whispered behind manicured hands. Every camera phone tilted subtly in my direction. And still I didn't move. I just existed. In that uniform. In that space. Like a monument no one could ignore. I could see Liam shifting nervously, his eyes darting between me and his bride. Eleanor's knuckles were white against the lace of her clutch. She turned, once locked eyes with me, and I saw it, the collapse. Her carefully constructed illusion cracked in real time. She hadn't just failed to erase me. She had invited me into the very heart of her performance, and now I sat like a mirror no one could avoid. Have you ever walked into a room that spent years pretending you didn't exist, and without saying a single word forced everyone to remember exactly who you are? As the ceremony stumbled forward, I remained seated at the back of the room, the hum of whispered confusion rising and falling like a tide. The minister, clearly flustered, skipped lines in his script, trying to pretend the disruption hadn't happened. Liam's smile faltered and Eleanor's fingers clenched the program in her lap so tightly I thought the paper might tear. And then came the moment that wasn't in any plan. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Maya's. It was hers. Ava. She stepped away from the altar with quiet, deliberate grace, her wedding gown flowing like water across the polished marble floor. She walked to the microphone, ignored the minister's hesitant glance, and turned not to the audience, not to her groom, but to me. Her voice, calm and firm, cut through the silence like a clarion. Before I begin my new life, she said, I must first honor the person who gave me the chance to have one at all. She turned her body fully toward the back of the room, toward me. And then in front of 300 guests, she raised her hand to her brow and delivered a perfect military salute. To Major General Haley Wittman, she declared. Gasps spread through the ballroom like a spark catching dry grass. The title echoed through the vaulted ceiling. Major General. Not helper, not servant, not forgotten daughter. My real name, my real rank spoken out loud in a room that had never once dared to acknowledge it. But Ava wasn't done. She lowered her hand, her voice growing stronger. This woman, this soldier saved my life, and the lives of 5 others during Operation Desert Aegis in Kandahar. I owe her everything. Then right on cue, the massive projector screen behind the altar flickered to life. Gone was the elegant monogram of Liam and Ava's initials. In its place, my unredacted after-action report. My name, my rank, my commendations. One by one, images appeared me in uniform in the field receiving the Silver Star. Photos of me with my unit. A wide shot of the very ceremony where I was pinned by General Alistair Vance himself. Then his face filled the screen in a pre-recorded video. He wore full-dress blues, looked straight into the camera, and said, Major General Haley Wittman's service to this country is exemplary. Her actions during Desert Aegis were nothing short of heroic. She is a leader of the highest integrity. and any attempt to undermine her record should be seen as a disgrace. Simultaneously, Maya hit send on her end. Every journalist's phone in the room buzzed as the full dossier landed in their inboxes. Eleanor tried to stand, but her knees buckled. Liam turned ghost pale. And I didn't move. I just sat still and let the truth speak louder than any accusation ever could. Have you ever felt your soul return to your body not with applause, not with vengeance, but with the undeniable, unstoppable arrival of truth? The silence after the video ended was a different kind of quiet, thick, reverent final. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Not a chair creaked, not a breath stirred. Then, from somewhere near the middle of the room, a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another. And another. The sound grew slowly at first, like the soft patter of rain on marble. Then it rolled forward like thunder. The guests stood one by one until the entire ballroom was on its feet. They weren't clapping for the bride or groom. They weren't applauding a wedding. They were saluting me. A soldier. A daughter they had never been allowed to see. A truth too long buried. I didn't rise. I didn't smile. I sat in perfect stillness and let the noise wash over me, not as pride, but as relief. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. Not because I had screamed for recognition, but because the truth had stood on its own, fully armed, fully witnessed. Eleanor couldn't move. Her mouth was twisted in silent horror, hands frozen in mid-gesture. She turned to Liam as if begging for rescue, but he looked just as paralyzed, exposed not only by what had been said, but by what he had never dared to say himself. Then Eleanor lost it. She surged forward from her seat, her composure in tatters. "Stop this!" she shrieked, voice cracking with rage. "This is a lie. All of it. She's manipulating all of you." Her words echoed through the hall like the scream of porcelain shattering on tile. She reached for the projector as if she could erase the files, the images, the evidence with her bare hands. But she was too late. The crowd parted from her like a wave recoiling from something rotten. No one helped her. No one stopped her collapse. She stood beneath the towering screen that bore my name and record, and for the first time in her carefully curated life, she looked small. Defeated. Alone. Somewhere behind her, a young aide tried to hush the chaos. But the guests weren't listening anymore. They were still clapping. Not for drama. For truth. For justice. For the quiet-seated figure at the back of the room who had finally been seen. And I, still unmoving, still watching, knew one thing with crystalline certainty. This was never about revenge. This was about return. About restoration. And I had just crossed back over the line they tried to erase. Have you ever witnessed a lie collapse in public so completely that no defense, no scream, no spin could ever revive it? I slipped out of the ballroom, quietly unnoticed in the swirling storm of gasps, camera flashes, and confused whispers. The echo of applause still rang in my ears, but I wasn't seeking validation. I was reclaiming oxygen after years of suffocation. The weight that had lived on my chest since I was 17 felt lighter, not because the fight was over, but because it had finally moved into the daylight. By the time I returned to my apartment, the first headlines had already begun to ripple through the digital tide. The invisible general, truth in dress blues. The salute heard around DC. I didn't respond to the dozens of texts and missed calls. I just watched. Watched as the machine Eleanor had fed for decades began turning on her. The Washington Post featured my story above the fold the very next morning. Not a tabloid spread. Not gossip. A front-page investigative piece cross-referenced and verified. They used the Pentagon files, the commendation from General Vance, and included Ava's speech word for word. Major General Haley Wittman, decorated officer erased by her own mother. The headline hit harder than I expected, not because it wasn't true, but because it was. And now the world knew. By noon, Eleanor had been removed from two of her most prestigious charity boards. Quietly, without ceremony. The fundraisers she once ruled began sending polite cancellations. Her inner circle of socialites, donors, and whisperers had vanished faster than champagne at a campaign event. Her reputation, once her most prized currency, had collapsed into rubble. Maya called that afternoon. "Congratulations," she said simply. "It's done." But we both knew it wasn't just about Eleanor's fall. It was about my rise from under the weight she'd built over me. Ava came by later that evening with something in her hand, a small box. Inside was the engagement ring Liam had given her, a diamond so large it looked like it belonged in a vault. "I left it on the table in the hotel suite," she said with a smirk. "Figured that was the kind of silence your brother would actually hear." I nodded. "You free now?" I asked. She smiled. For the first time in years. And just like that, I realized something I never expected to feel again: closure. Not the cinematic kind with fireworks or final speeches. The kind that sits quietly beside you and lets you breathe without bitterness. The truth was out. The applause had faded. But the silence I returned to wasn't hollow. It was clean. Earned. Free. Have you ever watched someone lose everything they built on lies and instead of feeling triumph, just felt peace? 2 days later, he showed up at my door. No warning. No appointment. Just the familiar knock I hadn't heard in years. I didn't answer right away. I stood there, hand on the knob, breathing in the silence that had taken so long to build. Then I opened it. Liam looked wrecked. His usually flawless hair was disheveled, the collar of his expensive shirt rumpled, dark circles carved beneath his eyes like bruises of guilt, or maybe just consequence. He didn't look angry. He looked stunned, like someone who had wandered into a war zone, thinking it was still a garden party. "You ruined everything," he said quietly, voice fraying at the edges. "Everything." "Did you really have to do it like that?" I didn't flinch. I didn't let him see even a flicker of emotion. I just looked at him, the boy I used to push on a swing set, the man who had watched me be humiliated over and over and said nothing. And finally I saw him clearly. Not as my brother. As a mirror I no longer needed. "No, Liam," I said, calm and cold. "I didn't ruin anything. I just turned on the lights." He blinked, stunned. "You chose your side a long time ago. You chose comfort over truth. You chose silence over integrity. You chose her, so now you live with what that costs." He opened his mouth as if to argue, but nothing came out. Just breath. Just the look of a man who had lost something he never thought he'd need to fight for. "I never meant," he started. "You never meant to protect me," I interrupted. "You never meant to question her. You never meant to see me. And now that the illusion is gone, you're not mourning the truth. You're mourning the loss of your place in the fantasy." His shoulders slumped. His eyes dropped to the floor. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt finished. I stepped back and closed the door softly but firmly. The lock clicked into place like the end of a chapter. Not out of rage, not out of spite, out of necessity. Because some ties, no matter how long they've been there, must be cut for anything true to grow. Have you ever realized that family isn't just about who shares your blood, but who shows up when your truth is under attack? The final piece was the house. Not just any house, his house. The one my father built with quiet dignity and steady hands. The one that Eleanor had turned into a showroom for status and shallow charm. The one she used to host senators, seduce donors, and shame her daughter into silence. And the one she tried to steal from me with a forged smile and a folder full of lies. My lawyer, a sharp, gray-templed man recommended by Maya, drafted the notice with surgical precision. It wasn't an eviction. That would have been easy, cruel, obvious. And I wasn't interested in cruelty. I was interested in justice. The document stated in clear legal language that, as the sole legal owner of the property granted through my father's will and protected by federal military estate law, I would not be requiring Eleanor to vacate the premises. Instead, effective immediately, she would be obligated to pay monthly rent at current fair market value for a home of that size and location in Milan, Virginia. The amount wasn't insignificant. It was enough to sting. But that wasn't the point. The document also stipulated that 100% of those payments would be deposited directly into a charitable trust, the Colonel Marcus Wittman Legacy Fund, a fund I had created in secret months before, a fund that would provide scholarships for children of fallen or wounded service members. My father's house would no longer be a temple to ego. It would become what he always wanted it to be, a shelter for legacy, a light for the unseen. She could keep her curtains, her crystal, her portrait over the fireplace. But now, each month when the money left her account, she'd know she was funding the very values she had spent a lifetime dismissing. She would live inside a monument to everything she tried to bury. When my lawyer delivered the paperwork, she didn't respond, not directly. But I later heard through a mutual acquaintance that she stood in the grand foyer for nearly an hour just staring at the front door. Maybe she was waiting for someone to walk in and undo it. Maybe she was remembering the day she handed me that apron. Maybe she was finally realizing that control isn't ownership. It's illusion. And illusions don't survive the truth. Have you ever taken back something sacred not with vengeance, but with clarity so sharp it reshapes the future? Several months passed. The news cycle faded. The internet found newer stories to consume. But peace doesn't arrive with silence, it arrives with alignment. My name wasn't in headlines anymore. My story wasn't trending. And yet, in the stillness that followed, I began to understand something deeper. I hadn't won a battle. I had closed a war that was never mine to begin with. Then one morning, an envelope arrived with a gold seal and the insignia of the United States Military Academy at West Point. Inside was a formal invitation. They wanted me to deliver the keynote address at the upcoming graduation ceremony. I held the letter in both hands for a long time, heart still, breath slow. My father would have wept. On the day of the event, I stood behind the podium, looking out at a sea of gray uniforms, all fresh-eyed and unbroken by life's darker chapters. These young cadets had memorized tactics and protocols. They knew about strategy, pressure points, precision. But they didn't yet know what I had learned, what the manuals never teach. So I gave them something else. You'll be trained for battlefields abroad, I began, but some of the hardest battles you'll ever fight won't be against foreign enemies. They'll be inside your own homes, your own families, and they won't require bullets. They'll require truth. The audience leaned in, not with politeness, but with hunger. Honor isn't just the word stitched into your uniform, I continued. It's the boundary you set when someone tries to reduce you into silence. It's the moment you stand alone if necessary and say, I will not disappear for your comfort. I paused, letting the air fill with something heavier than applause. The most courageous act you may ever take isn't leading a platoon. It's speaking truth to the people who are supposed to love you, and doing it without anger, without vengeance, but with unshakable clarity. When I stepped off that stage, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded, as if I had finally spoken the words my father tried to teach me that night under the stars, except this time 1,000 young soldiers heard them too. It wasn't a victory speech. It was a map. A compass I had drawn, not for me, but for anyone who would one day find themselves lost in the dark. Have you ever realized that your greatest act of service might not be your medals, but the wisdom you pass on to someone trying to survive in silence? When I returned to my apartment in D.C., the sun was just beginning to set, casting soft gold across the Potomac River outside my window. I set down my briefcase, loosened my collar, and finally allowed myself to breathe. That's when I saw the email. The sender was unfamiliar. The subject line was simple. Thank you. I clicked it expecting maybe a short note of appreciation from a former cadet, but what opened was a video file. I pressed play. A young woman, barely 18, appeared on screen. She stood in what looked like a college dorm, a university banner pinned to the wall behind her. Her voice trembled at first. "Hi, my name is Sarah Jensen. My dad was Sergeant David Jensen. He was killed in Iraq when I was 6. I was told this message might reach the person who gave me my scholarship." Her eyes welled, but she didn't look away. "I just want to say thank you. I didn't think people like me mattered to anyone. I didn't think college was possible. But then I got the letter funded by the Colonel Marcus Wittman Legacy Fund." She held up the letter, visibly worn from being read over and over. "Whoever you are, you didn't just give me tuition. You gave me a chance, a future. You believed in me when no one else did. So, thank you." She smiled through her tears. "I won't waste it." The video ended and the screen faded to black. I sat there for a long time, hands still on the keyboard, heart full in a way medals and applause had never quite managed. The house, the legal wins, the public redemption, they mattered. But this was purpose. This was peace. This was legacy. I walked over to the window, watched the river shimmer in the evening light, and whispered softly, "Dad, we did it." I wasn't a ghost in a house anymore. I wasn't the daughter shoved into silence. I was the guide star he always said I would be. Not flashy, not loud, but constant, steady, quietly pulling someone else home through the dark. Have you ever realized that the truest measure of your worth isn't what the world sees, but what you leave behind in someone else's life? If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if your truth was dismissed or your worth questioned, I want you to remember this: sometimes your silence isn't weakness. It's waiting. And when the time is right, your quiet truth will speak louder than a lifetime of noise. If you're a parent listening, ask yourself, are you seeing your children clearly, or just who you hoped they'd be? And to those like me who fought their battles in silence, your story matters. Have you ever lived through something like mine? How did you rise? What did you learn? Tell me in the comments, and if this story meant something to you, please subscribe, and share. Because truth deserves an audience. Thank you for listening. You are not alone.